So I think recording has started. I think that we should start the session. Let me introduce the today's speaker and today's topic. The speaker before us is Professor Vasanthi Srinivasan. She is my teacher in Hyderabad Central University. So she teaches political science in HCU. She is one of the best mind of India. She has done her PhD in political science from Carleton University, Ottawa, and she previously taught at the College of Humanities, Ottawa. She has been a Commonwealth and New India Foundation scholar, and she has been a visiting scholar at the Center for Advanced Study of India, University of Pennsylvania. Madam, can you help me to pronounce it actually?
University of Pennsylvania.
University of Pennsylvania in 2009, and she is the author of various articles, and her three prominent work are Gandhi's Conscience Keeper, C. Rajgopalachari and Indian Politics, that was published by the Permanent Black in 2009. Then her second great work is Hindi Spirituality and Virtue Politics, that is published by the Sage in 2011. And the third and recent work she has published, the title of that book is Virtue and Human Ends, the Political Idea from Indian Classics, that is published by the Orient Blackswan in 2021. Now, her research interests are in the area of Indian political ideas, comparative political thought, interface between technology and politics. So today, the title of our talk is Virtue and Politics. So if I am not wrong, that this topic will come under Indian political ideas, right? So, I have not read her work yet, so I will read. I have already purchased that book. Today, actually, I purchased that Hindu Spirituality and Virtue Politics. So after your talk, madam, I will read it. I hope that I can get you. So the topic is virtue and politics. Unlike West, let me introduce the topic like this. So unlike West, in India, religion and spirituality is the source of moral and civic virtue. Besides Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Dalai Lama, they have consciously tried to relate spirituality with politics. And what is this spirituality? Now, spirituality is an approach to divine and trans-empirical source of being, which is non-dogmatic, non-theistic, and experimental in nature. And this spiritualism or spirituality is possible if the individual will have the virtue. I mean, if you are not virtuous, then spiritualism, I think it is not possible actually. So today the speaker will speak on virtue, that how virtue such as, principled loyalty, that's a virtue, principled loyalty. It's a very technical term, madam will make us understand. Principled loyalty are central to the real politic tradition of Indian tradition. It will also show how political virtues such as mutual aid, generosity, ethical tolerance were at the core of the reformist politics of Vinoba Bhave and C. Rajagopalachari in the post-independent Indian politics. So mainly she will focus on that. I asked her to give us a brief idea on which she will speak. She has provided this idea and I just read it out before you. So right now I am requesting my teacher, Professor Srinivasan. I request her to use some lucid language so that my students in this periphery, I call it, I am belonging to a university that is situated in the periphery in the academic sense actually, so that they can understand your work and they can do research on your work as well. So I request you, madam, so please move on, but in a very lucid manner. So I'm why I'm saying lucid manner, as a student, I was finding very difficult to understand you. So, I mean, sorry, madam. So now you can continue. Yes, madam.
Thank you, Himanshu, for that introduction. May I request at least one or two of you to switch on the videos? Otherwise, one ends up looking at oneself, and that's not very interesting. So maybe a
Okay.
couple of you could switch on your videos. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm extremely appreciative of this invitation, especially because Dr. Himanshu is actually trying to enthuse all of you in different parts of India, but particularly, as he calls it, in this peripheral region, to take an interest in academic research and academic writing. I always thought that my strongest point was being extremely clear, but students will always tell us from their standpoint whether you are being clear or not. And the more we teach undergraduate students, the more we become clearer in what we want to say. All right. So for this presentation, what I thought I would do was actually draw your attention to what I think is the real politique tradition in Indian thought. By real politique, we understand the political perspective that regards power and success as critical, as the essence of politics. And therefore, I have in mind people like Machiavelli and Kautilya, who you may be familiar with. And whenever we broach a topic like virtue and politics, students are often skeptical. They are schooled in Machiavelli and Kautilya, but they are also schooled in the in life, in worldly life, and they think that virtues and politics have no connection in the real world. This may be wonderful talk by scholars sitting in peripheral and other universities, but they really have nothing to say to real world politics. That's why I thought I would start not with the epics and Puranas, but I would start um, with these hardcore realist thinkers and show to you how ethics was not dismissed or devalued by even these thinkers. So let's first, many of you may be familiar with Machiavelli. So let's first take a look at Machiavelli's Prince, because we all begin from Western political thought and then we'll move to Indian political ideas. So in Machiavelli's Prince, we all know there are some notorious chapters where he talks about virtues and vices, and he makes vices appear to be virtues. If you recall in The Prince, he will tell us that being generous, keeping promises, and being trustworthy may be wonderful religious values. They may be good for individuals, but they are very devastating for the prince who is seeking power. And therefore, in politics, nothing succeeds like success. And it's not very useful for politicians to actually practice virtue. On the contrary, they must, however, be appearing virtuous. And so Machiavelli tutors the prince on how to manage appearances in such a way that even though one is not really generous, one must learn to appear generous. Even though one is not really trustworthy, one must simply appear to be trustworthy. In our present day parlance, we would think of political managers and political image builders who will, in fact, create this image for the politician, whereas true virtue, it really doesn't pay in politics, right? You would all agree that this is one perspective we get from Machiavelli. I find it very difficult if everyone switches off the video, so I will not talk. some of you must keep your videos on, please. It is not possible simply for us to look at the screen and teach. I insist even with my students that you have to switch on the video. So I have some eye contact with at least your image on the screen. All right, so now we have, if you move from Machiavelli to Kautilya, you get a similar lesson that virtue really has very little to do with politics. And we find that throughout the Arthashastra, we hear very little about virtues, and we hear more and more about acquiring power and a ruthless exercise of power as being at the very core of political success. But then I decided to probe further, and I looked at the best rendition we have of Chanakya's thought in a play called Mudra Rakshasa. Of course, I've looked at a whole series of other texts, but I want to make this talk interesting and entertaining for all of you, even as we look at a weighty topic like virtue and politics. In Mudra Rakshasa, which is written by Vishaka Datta, we have an excellent rendering of how people would have received Kautilya's Arthashastra. We normally don't look at literature in political thought, and I think that is a very big weakness we have. We think that political thought must be some kind of a serious opus that must be boring and forbidding, and only then it qualifies as a text in political thought. And in my recent work, I've tried to disabuse people of that opinion, and I've looked at a whole series of literary texts which are very rewarding in themselves, but also from a political standpoint. Now, in Mudra Rakshasa, we have a Chanakya who is being presented by someone who would have read Kautilya seriously and who would have understood Kautilya much more from a historical standpoint than you and me do reading the Arthashastra today in the 20th century. So what does Vishakadatta do with the Chanakya in Mudra Rakshasa? If you know the story, Mudra Rakshasa is actually set in the early part, one would think around or prior to the Gupta Empire. But its setting, its internal historical setting has to do with Chandragupta Maurya and Chanakya in Chandragupta Maurya's court. Chanakya has just, of course, succeeded in enthroning Chandragupta Maurya on the throne of the Nanda, Mahananda. And Mahananda had a very, very important prime minister called Rakshasa. And this whole play is about the seal, mudra, the seal ring of Rakshasa. What happens is that Rakshasa is still beholden and loyal to the deceased Nanda dynasty. And he is trying, by cobbling together various alliances, to once again oust Chandragupta Maurya and place someone who was loyal to the Nandas in the throne. And so we have both Chanakya and Rakshasa, who are the two superior minds, and they are both engaging in elaborate intrigue in order to outwit one another. But the difference is that Chanakya is extremely ruthless, has no family, has no love for, because he has no family, he has no love of his own. He's completely devoted to Chandragupta Maurya. Rakshasa, on the contrary, has a family, he has friends. And so even though he's smarter or as smart as or smarter than Chanakya in political wisdom, all his plans backfire. And what we see then, I'm not going to tell you the whole story. You should go and read Vishakadatta's Mudra Rakshasa, which is available online. The Kale translation is available, and it's a great play. So take a look at it. What we find that, though, is through a series of stratagems, we find that Chanakya is trying to entrap Rakshasa and make him switch his loyalties. He's not trying to eliminate him, which would have been the easier thing to do. So why is Chanakya so interested in securing the loyalty of Rakshasa? we find that he says, in fact, he says, Rakshasa is my equal in political wisdom. And he sends various spies to Rakshasa's place of hiding. He tries various ways in which to bring Rakshasa to heel so that he will accept the monarchy of Chandragupta Maurya. And Chanakya actually wants to make him the prime minister and retire to the forest. I thought this was very interesting. And I kept probing what could be the reason why Chanakya is presented like this. Now, remember, more than the way we understand Kautilya, Vishakadatta is closer to Kautilya's time, right? Writing around, say, sometime around, I mean, the dates are very, very dicey. People sometimes talk about 5th century and people sometimes talk about the 3rd century of the Common Era. But whatever it is, it was closer to Kautilya's time than it is to our time. So we find then that at the end, so we have a Chanakya who is trying so hard to make Rakshasa switch his loyalties, and is very ruthless in the process, as we know, of course, from all accounts of Chanakya. So what he does is, not only is the Nanda dynasty completely eliminated, but there is one poor brother or someone of Nanda called Sarvartha Siddhi, who's become a renouncer and who actually poses no threat whatsoever to Chandragupta Maurya. But Chanakya says, even if there is one remote relative of Nanda, Rakshasa will not switch his loyalty. So he doesn't flinch from eliminating even this poor renunciate. And we have a Rakshasa who is trying somehow to poison Chandragupta Maurya, to do various kinds of things, but all of it backfires on him and none of his strategies actually work. And at the end of the play, Rakshasa is, of course, very frustrated, and the king that he was relying on is no more trusting him. He has lost, and finally he comes to a point where he realizes that he has been outwitted by Chanakya, and his best friend Chandana Dasa is going to be executed by Chanakya on some false charge, at which point he comes out of hiding and he decides to surrender to Chanakya and say, do with me what you will, but spare my friend. And Chanakya, who's been waiting for this moment, says, look, I have been waiting for you to come to me, not because I want to execute you, because people like you who are competent, who are talented, who are loyal, are actually assets for a king. And so I have been, I mean, he doesn't say all this, but this is all implied in the conversation. And I wanted you to switch your loyalties. So I wanted to go through the story with you because here is a Chanakya, a ruthless political strategist who recognizes the importance of principled loyalty. Loyalty alone is a political virtue in monarchies. Kings will require, as politicians today do, trusted lieutenants. But what we find is, you might say this was not true of realpolitik, but we know it is true in the sense that someone as astute as Chanakya recognizes it. Now, we want to move from here. So what we find then is a paradox in that Rakshasa is extremely loyal to the Nanda king. And it's precisely his loyalty that Chanakya finds a very important and prized virtue. And he doesn't want to destroy that virtue. He simply wants Rakshasas and his talent to be enlisted for the services of Chandragupta Maurya. Now, I want to move from here to another text, which is the Panchatantra. If you know the Panchatantra story, the main story in book 1, called Separation of Friends, is about a friendship between Damanaka and between Pingalaka and Sanjeevaka, not Damanaka. We'll come to Damanaka in a minute. Pingalaka is the lion king and Sanjeevaka is the friendly and wise bull. And there we find that there's a very striking friendship that develops between the two. the Lion King is standing for aristocratic virtues, very much like a noble monarch. And the wise bull stands for the priestly power that, or the spiritual authority that was supposed to guide temporal power in ancient Indian theory of government. And the bull Sanjeevaka is found and becomes a friend thanks to the interceding of Damanaka, who is actually the parasitic and opportunistic jackal. And there we find that the friendship between Damanaka and the friendship between Pingalaka and Sanjeevaka becomes so intense. And it appears that the noble aristocratic king, who was very intent on ruling, suddenly gets captivated by spiritual wisdom peddled by the bull, and decides that perhaps philosophical life is much more exciting than the political life, and stops fending for the jackals, which are parasites. And this makes the jackal, especially Damanaka, very envious and angry. And so Damanaka sows, if you all know the Panchatantra story, which you may have forgotten and you may have thought had no political value, what happens there is that there is dissension or bheda sown by Damanaka, and that leads to the assassination of the bull. Of course, when we were children, we read the story, and the moral lesson we drew was that one must make friendship with equals. And this is what happens when you make friendships with unequals, with people in power. And that was the end of that story. But I realized that the Panchatantra is actually a very complex and multi-layered text. And it has fantastic amount of material precisely on this connection between spiritual authority and temporal power in the guise of, as we see, Sanjeevaka and Pingalaka. But it also goes on and on about ordinary friendships in everyday life that we make. Should we make friends with equals? Do we not routinely make friends with unequals? Do we not routinely make friendships with strangers? Are we not often attracted to people who come hailing us to be our friends, and we don't look at whether they have property, whether they are the same gender, whether they are the same caste? That friendship is a lot like love. It happens to us and it makes us better people. So there's a lot in Panchatantra. In fact, this recent book of mine looks exhaustively at why we should take friendship seriously in political thought, as in fact Aristotle does, and as many other political theorists in the West have done. Anyway, the reason I'm now talking about Panchatantra in the context of virtue and politics is because I think in book 1 of the Panchatantra, which is separation of friends, Mitra Bheda, we have the question that is raised of whether loyalty of Sanjeevaka, which is a wise bull, but the loyalty is very fragile. And at the first hint of the Lion King being discontented with him, he's ready to go for a fight. Then there is loyalty of Damanaka, who is an opportunist, who knows Rajniti. But in Rajniti, we often have many opportunists who surround people in power, parasites. They are loyal, but their loyalty is based on their self-interest. And then there is, contrast, the principal loyalty of Mudra Rakshasa. So once again, we find Panchatantra is a hardcore realist text. It's not a normative text, in the sense it's not a text that's talking about how politics should be. It is not a text that's based on how human beings should be. It is a politics that's based on how human beings are, in fact, present and acting in the world. And it gives us lessons to live our lives well within a set of constraints. Okay? So these are two realist texts. And in both texts, I wanted to alert you to the fact that virtues are not peripheral to politics, even when these theorists are taking power and success seriously. I want to leave this there, and we can come back to it in our discussions if we want. I want to now move to recent history. And I think we get the same idea from our contemporary reformist politicians and saints. For this, I want to look at Vinoba. So now you may say, ma'am, we know the Panchatantra, we don't know Mudra Rakshasa. Great, you're telling us about realpolitik, but what are actually the sources? So I want to move, theoretically, you might agree with me that virtues and politics are connected. But now we want to move to what are the sources of virtue? How do we, in fact, act virtuously in ordinary life? You know, a lot of us are virtuous. After I finish, I will take questions, but in the discussion. Is that okay? Yeah, okay. So the most immediate thing that you must remember is that we are all schooled in good habits. So the way we are socialized into virtue is through good habits. Respect for elders, which I think is very much rooted in students who come from the periphery, and which Dr. Himanshu had much more than probably students who came from Delhi. I know this is being recorded and this is a provocative statement, but respect for elders is a good habit that is instilled into us. And in fact, I had the peculiar experience when I had just come back from Canada to India, and the students from Orissa would insist on touching my feet, and I would say, no, you can't do that. You can only do that to the gods, and you can only do that to the spiritual acharyas. You cannot do it to me. I'm just a secular teacher. And I used to be deeply embarrassed, and I used to tell them, don't do this. This is not something you should do in the university. But now when I look back, I think it was not that you should touch anybody's feet to express your respect. But in general, I think showing respect for elders is a very, very important Indian virtue. And we are schooled into these virtues through good habits. And we are sustained in these virtues through the great stories that we hear, not through theories that we hear. Act like Karna. So the stories of Karna, I know somebody in real life who adores Karna. But he's a very stingy chap. And yet I find that because he adores Karna, in public he likes to appear very generous. And you know, we should always remember that virtue, whether it is little or a lot, is still virtue. So whether you want to do it because you appear to others as great, or you appear to your antaratman, your inner witness as great, in both cases, it's worth praising, right? So this young man, I know him individually in a domestic space, in his domestic space, and I find him very, very stingy. But when I find him outside, I find him very generous. And for a while, I wasn't able to figure out, but now I think that he wants to be like Karna, and that in itself, I think, is a praiseworthy goal. Of course, we all live in a world where generosity is not being prized or rewarded. And we all feel insecure with contemporary civil society. So we don't want to be generous. We want to cling to what we have. And we want to cling to it as if it's dear life. And yet when you have an exemplar like Karna, every now and then that clinging is loosened a little bit inside you, right? And I think the loosening is what happens when you hear these great stories. We are virtuous not because we read Kant, nor because we become experts in moral theory. I think that's a load of nonsense. We are virtuous because our hearts are tuned to the right things. And the more heart-churning stories you hear, the more ethically you become stronger. And I think that's why our stories are so great. And not enough work has been done, excepting by the astute politicians in the Indian context, on the extraordinary power of these stories from our epics and from our Puranas. So here I look at, of course, we all know act like Karna. We also know the more famous one, which is Krishna's advice to Arjuna: act like Rama, don't act like me. Because we know that Rama is the epitome or the embodiment of dharma, right? Even today, if you walk out, people will teach you all kinds of critical thought, so called, in the classroom, which is neither here nor there. And that critical thought will only try to tell you about all the not so dharmic deeds of Rama. But then today, when I walk out of the campus I live in and go to the nearest Juggi Jopadi and say, what is the name of your slum? They will say Ayodhya Puri, or they will say Ram Nagar, or they will say Sitapuri. This is the power of archetypes. This is the power of mythic archetypes. So act like Rama. Why do I pick on this? I did some work on Vinoba Bhave in that book that your professor just mentioned. And there I look at Vinoba Bhave's Bhudan movement, which again is not taught in our Indian political thought courses. I don't know what we teach. We give you knowledge that is esoteric. It doesn't build on what you already know. It puts some new stuff into your heads, which confuses you more and more. I have been in the teaching field for 2 decades in India to say all this confidently. Now, in Bhudan, did you know that Vinoba Bhave actually was walking from Shivrampalli, where he had the last Harijan conference, and people went and told him that, sir, there is a lot of Bhaiji, there's a lot of tumult in the Telangana region. The communists are confiscating land. The Telangana armed struggle was at its peak. Can you please come to our village? And he walked from there to Pochampalli. And that is where, sitting under a tree, he went to do his morning, he had walked through a park. I have been to Pochampalli and I did some work on the oral narratives of this event. And they showed me the path through which he came. The generation which saw him launch Bhudan is slowly dying. And there are 3 or 4 people who remembered, and they were really small children when he had come. But he walked to Pochampalli and he was hosted by Ramchandra Reddy. You will know the significance of this person also in a moment. And he went away to do his morning prayers, and a bunch of Harijans, Dalits, as we call them today, and as they like to be called today, approached him and said, look, we are about 40 families, and we want about 80 acres, though 2 acres per family, to do our sagu, to do our cultivation. And can you please help us? And he said, look, I'm a sannyasin. I will write to the government. And at that point, Nehru was talking about land ceilings. He said, I will do what I can and we'll see about it. Then in the evening, they all gathered again. The same families had come back. And the same request was made in the public. Ramchandra Reddy, who was a huge landowner, owning about hundreds of acres, was present at the meeting. And he got up instantly and he said, I donate 100 acres. Vinoba was stunned. Even though he had hundreds of acres, I think he had some 1,200 acres or something. And Vinoba said, are you serious? He said, yes. He said, you come back tomorrow morning. Vinoba then writes in his autobiography, moved by love. This is the point I was trying to make. In order to be generous, we have to be moved by love. There he says that I could not sleep that night. I kept asking myself whether the huge land problem in this country can be solved through voluntary donations. And that's how Bhudan was born. The next day, I am astonished because now when I talk to people, the people who witnessed have passed on the stories to their children. And everybody will tell you this story when you go to Pochampalli. You say, what happened that day? They say, Bhai Saab and his wife came. Bhai Saab is Ramchandra Reddy. And his wife came that morning, and Vinoba asked them. He said, yeah, they said, yes, we want to donate. And Madam Ji, they told me, he poured water and there was a Dan Patra. So there was a deed that was executed, and there was a pouring of water with Dadami, which is the classic formula of sacrifice, right? And so over and over again, I heard this story is etched in their memories of the ritual of giving, which is directly drawn from the religious rituals. And when I looked more and more at his rhetoric, I realized that people in Bihar who are donating call themselves Bahubalis. You are not familiar with those Bahubalis now. You are familiar with the other Bahubali from the celluloid nonsense. I don't know what that story is, so I'm calling it nonsense. You have to forgive me. Maybe it was a profound story, but I doubt it. Now, what was the archetype at work? The archetype was of Mahabali. So and it's classic, if I wish I had pulled out some of the slides I have, but if you look at Vinoba, he's a tall man, fair man, and very, very sannyasin looking, all that he had. So he says that after what he saw in Pochampalli, he decided, he says, I dreamt that I will be able to get 50 million acres of land through Dana. The man had great dreams, audacious dreams. And of course, he collected about 4.4 million acres as per government reports in 13 years of walking the length and breadth of India. Nehru was very impressed with these stories, and Nehru said, why don't you come to Delhi? Let's have a conversation. Nehru was one great man. Even though he was very modern in his views, he was moved by all these stories, and he would pick up a great idea from wherever it came. And Vinoba said, yes, I'll come. He took 3 months walking to Delhi. 4.4 million acres of land. Compare this to 1 million acres confiscated by the communists through armed struggle, and 7 millions which was taken by the state through so-called land sealing acts. A lot of it was actually swindled by the petty bureaucrats. So you have this in front of you, and I found that a lot of donations came not only from rich people. Very soon, Vinoba set in motion a revolution in giving and a revolution in generosity. People who could give land gave land, but people who wanted to do Shram Dan, in fact, in your part of Orissa, there were all kinds of new sacrifices or yajnas. Shram Dan was born. So he said that everybody can participate in this. And what is this actually a lesson in? It is a lesson in love of communities, isn't it? It's a lesson in mutual aid. These are political virtues. Today we are, I think, so much more selfish. The more you give, the happier you become. And he didn't want everything. He said, I want 1/6 of your land. So he said, I am not prescribing that all of you should abandon and dispossess yourself of everything. I want you to give what you can. And so there were rickshaw pullers from the city who came and said, I have a small fragment in my village that I'm not using, and I want to give it to you, Vinobaji. And Vinoba would say, no, I can't take it from you because you're already a struggling rickshaw puller and you must have that land for future. So he would take in a ritual sense and he will say, I'm returning it to you. So he was very prudent. He didn't take from everybody. He took from people who he knew could afford to give that little, and he built on those donations. The most important thing that I learned in all this it was not the amount that people gave, but it was overcoming conflict, resentment that was at the key, that was at the center of this movement. Today, we are only building on a politics of resentment. And this really is very, when you hate somebody, you don't feel very nice inside yourself. When you dislike somebody, there's something inside yourself that doesn't like that feeling or that experience. Human beings inside themselves are actually very genuine and good people, right? And some of these statesmen and saints were building on that innate goodness in us, the mutual help we want to extend one another. So I think the figures are there in my book, and your teacher can give you a Xerox of the Vinoba chapter if anyone is interested, and they can go further and read as to how I draw from his rhetoric the importance of building concord or harmony in our politics, which is in short supply today. I now want to move to, so I'm just giving you nuggets from my work that shows you the connections. Now I want to move to Rajgopalachari, which in fact was my first book, and I still learn a lot from him in terms of how prudent statesmanship must be fashioned in a democracy. And once again, Rajgopalachari recognized the importance of the epics in fostering virtues such as ethical tolerance. So if you noticed, I've talked about loyalty, principle loyalty. I've just talked about generosity as a political virtue. And I'm now moving to talk about ethical tolerance. Of course, there are many other virtues, but there's no time for all that today. Now, one of the things that I found very rewarding in Rajgopalachari was his insistence that we must build on the natural love people have of one's own. We all love our children more than we love the neighbor's children. We all then love our village more than we love the neighbor's village. So, it goes from a love of one, unless you know how to love your own, you won't be able to love others. If you don't know what it means to love your own culture, then you won't know what it means to respect another culture. So Rajgopalachari thought that calling all this nepotism and fanaticism is all very, very myopic. The key is to build on this love of one's own and enlarge the orbit of that love. So if you know how to be reasonably proud of your own culture, I think you all from Orissa should be very proud of the extraordinary spiritual culture of the Rath Yatra. I think it's just a monumental event that they pull off every year in different parts of Orissa. And it's a great lesson to actually, it's a great source to research on how different communities come together to pull this off year after year after year. And exactly not only how they come together, but how there are different permutations and combinations of some people being equal, some people being equal in certain contexts, and everybody is included, but in a different kind of context. If you want to read on this, then the person to read is Frederick Marglin. And she's a fantastic book on the Devadasis in Orissa called Wives of the God King. And she's also done extraordinary amounts of work on the Rath Yatra culture. Frederick Marglin, Marg as in M-A-R-G, L-I-N, as in L-I-N, Marglin, and Frederick Apfel Marglin. In fact, they're a couple and they have done extensive work on Orissa. Now, Rajaji says, in fact, there's a very interesting joke. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Rajaji's rendering of the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. And this joke was very popular in the South, that in one of the UPSC exams, or some exam, the student interview, the student was asked, so who's the author of Ramayana? And the person said Rajgopalachari. That is how popular his renderings were of the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. These are the Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan renderings, and I'm told that even now they are bestsellers. And in the rendering of the Mahabharata, he says that these are the value of a lot of these stories consists in the fact, and I quote him, that great and good men sometimes have to do bad things, and that even the most virtuous of men cannot be good all the time. An understanding of this helps in increasing tolerance. And I was so struck by that statement. Often we all know the stories of Yudhishthira, we all know the stories of Rama and Vali, we know the story of Rama abandoning Sita. Great and good men sometimes do bad things. And that even the best of men cannot be virtuous all the time. Therefore, what is the lesson? If you are a Machiavellian, you will say, don't be good. But if you are a Rajgopalachari, you will say, this will try to understand the circumstances and constraints within which you and me must act well and act virtuously. And when we reflect on these stories, we learn to become ethically tolerant. Not to become bad, but to become ethically tolerant. That's important. Today, what happens is, yes, I know all of you are raising hands, but you'll have to wait. I'm concluding soon. We find that people are often very self-righteous when it comes to morality. They become very, very shrill. And we become very simplistic. So we say, oh, he's so great. Oh, no, but no, you know what? He's not so great. I know he did this one terrible thing in his childhood, therefore he's not so great. The ethical sensibility, that is our judgment. Our judgment must be tuned well. So we must know how to act well, which we do, as I said, through good habits and by learning about these great stories and having these great role models. But we must also, as citizens, learn how to judge well. And when we reflect on these stories, for Rajgopalachari, when we reflect on a Yudhishthira or when we reflect on a Rama and Vali and many other stories, we learn to become more patient. We learn to judge better. We learn to understand the constraints, and we don't have to forgive, but we just become, to be tolerant is to become more mindful, to become watchful. So we don't easily dismiss away. And we can come back. I'm sure there'll be questions, and I would like to explain this point at greater length if there are questions. So what do I want to do now? I've given you all these instances of people who are looking at sources of virtue. And I want to now conclude with one or two anecdotes for you, which will impress upon you the importance of these stories as they are lived out by people who are not interested in political theory or ethical theory, people on the ground. And for them, how virtue and politics are connected. Two anecdotes. One is an anecdote from a domestic help I have. And every time Ram Navami comes and we discuss the rituals that she does or I do, she said once to me, I said, why do you regard Rama in such high esteem? Don't you know what he did to Sita? And he says, that may be true, Amma, but I want to tell you that Rama as a king, but also as a divine king, Even he had to suffer when he came to earth. And when I remember that, I bear my suffering lightly. I thought this was extraordinary. Both Rama and Sita move people and strengthen them, because ordinary life, you're all very young today, but when you grow older, you realize that ordinary life is full of dukkha. And that is because everything is impermanent, as the Buddhists say. One must know how to live well. It also means one must know how to face the suffering that comes one's way. And in these, theories don't help us. Stories help us. Our cultural role models guide us and strengthen us. So what did she mean when she looks up to Rama or Sita? Not only is she bearing her suffering lightly, which is a virtue. These days, people go and talk so much about some small little suffering they have. They'll write a big novel about it and everybody says, oh, so sad. Such nonsense. To know how to suffer with dignity and grace, these people learn from the role models. That in itself is a virtue. But on top of that, in the face of suffering, they do not abandon their virtues of hard work or mutual aid. The second anecdote I want to tell you is something that you may have heard and you may have wondered and dismissed. Year after year, if you were to go to some villagers, I do this all the time, strangers, and talk to them. Oh, so why did you vote for so and so? Oh, the rains were very good this year, so I voted for so and so. Now, what's the connection between rains and a particular politician in power? You would think it's superstition. There's no connection in your minds because we have completely corrupted your minds. We have suppressed whatever knowledge you may have brought from your cultures. It took me a while to understand the connection. And it took me reading of Sangam classics, because in the Tamil literature, this is very, very well established. If good rains come, that means the Raja is doing his job well. Good rains are an indicator that the ruler has performed well. How? Today you think it is cloud seeding that is sending the rain, and these fellows are cloud seeding in all the wrong places. The understanding here is this. You and me, we only watch a small part of the ruler. Sometimes we don't even watch a small part. We get whatever garbled and distorted version we get from the newspaper. Right? Okay. What about your political system? Your political system also often lets off grand criminals. The more criminal you are, the grander a criminal you are, the better the chance that you'll be let off by the system. You're all smiling. That is your real world experience. That's why you wonder what is the connection between virtue and politics. It's good to write books on this. Now, I figured out when I read these classics that they had another level. And what's that other level? So your political system might let you off. Your legal system is so damn corrupt, it might let you off. Your juridical system is compromised. Suppose the entire world is compromised. Hidden in this observation that we call superstition is another level of understanding. The sun and the moon are not compromised, my dear. They are cosmic witnesses to your corruption. So there is a cosmic level of justice. Dharma at one level is that cosmic level of justice. At that level, if the rains come, then the understanding is that the gods have watched even when you and me are asleep. And therefore, the ruler is worth another term. This cannot be causally proved. Many things in life, like the Jivatman and the Antaratman, cannot be causally proven. They are experienced by us. Their truth is something that we have to experience through mature reflection and application to our lives. So I want to leave it here. And I think it's a very intelligible way of understanding the connection between virtue and politics. If you were to ask, why should I be virtuous? As a ruler, in the final analysis, the response from Indian classics would be, don't think your virtue is only rewarded or watched by all too human systems. It is watched and rewarded by cosmic systems which are in place. So there is a chain of virtue. If you do your dharma, then the seasons do their dharma. We are all connected in this cosmic chain of being. I think this is more than any scientific understanding, I think this is an extraordinarily noble and fascinating understanding of the human condition, which we in India are fortunate still to have alive in our midst, both in the minds of people, in the practices of people, and in the classics that those people cherish. It is our impoverished educational system that's distancing us from seeing these riches and the ways in which this thought is deeply moving and ennobling for us in living out our lives. I hope that gave you some sense of the kind of work that I do. Thank you very much for listening to me. And now I can take the questions.
So thank you, madam. I mean, before you answer the questions of the students, I mean, we have some retired professors. What I can see, Professor Gitanjali Das was there, Professor Rajlakshmi Mishra, then Professor Swarnamay Tripathi. These are three madams who are with us, but right now I cannot see Professor Gitanjali Das. But before I come to these professors, I mean, let me say that, many stories that, madam, you know, and many stories we also know that is related with the Indian classics. And, you are very much true. I mean, one can understand it only when one will decolonize its mind, right? And you gave much importance on the meaningful than mechanical. You taught us that one should be meaningful than to be, mechanical. And the way these Indian classics are quite meaningful, I mean, it talked about virtue, and virtue is desirable for politics. So politics means it is positive, it is selflessness, it is not selfishness. I mean, you told that how, another thing you told that we give much importance on, I'm in trouble, but we don't say that how much happiness we have. Generally, there is a song in Bollywood, Dukh ke andar sukh ki jyoti, dukh hi sukh ka gyan, dard leke janam leta har koi insan. So it basically means that you can know pleasure through by suffering, right? But today we are experiencing the opposite. Today we are seeing that that people are actually sukhi, and when some dukha that comes to them, then they think that they deserve to be sukhi, but they don't want to be dukhi. But actually the breed of sukha is there in the dukha, and you highlighted that point. So I am very much thankful. And there is also another song, Bollywood song, let me say it, Dunya mein kitna gam hai to mera gam kitna kam hai. So that is also another way of approaching your life and your social situation. I mean, already Bollywood songs has, I think some of the Bollywood songs has already decolonized their, mind. So in your talk, you said how virtue is important for politics, how virtue is desirable for the politics. Politics needs virtue in order to sustain. Then you talked about, principled loyalty, that is loyalty based on some moral and ethical grounds. Then you talked about how friendship with equal is important. What is the importance of giving? You gave the example of Karna. Karna was giving everything and he was feeling very happy. And today I think that giving, becoming happy after giving something, that virtue, we are experiencing or we are listening in Mahabharata. But in today's society and politics, the virtue of giving and becoming pleasure, that has become a distant dream. Then you talked about how Indian classics is more practical than philosophy. So it's not philosophic, it is also very much practical. Then you talked about, Indian classics is all about, it provides a kind of politics that is based on selfless interest, not based on the selfish interest. Then you told that how politics in the Indian classics was very much positive. These are all, interrelated. Whatever I'm just saying, these are all interrelated. So what one can achieve through, I mean, in your talk, I got a sense that, so today we are talking about rights, and we think that through demanding, through our rights, we can get our pleasure, we can get our happiness. But in your talk, what I got the sense that what one can achieve through rights, more than it can be achieved through duty and through sacrifice. And I think for that you need to have some virtue, you need to have some spiritual understanding, and I mean that's it, and you can get the happiness. And it's all about metaphysical, right? So whatever there in our physical world, that's not the reality. I am also teaching the Indian political thought, and I can say it very confidently with my little understanding that human understanding is very much limited. And after the emergence of the post-behavioralism, there is a question about the human rationality. And meaningful and relevance, these 2 points has been highlighted by the post-behavioralism. So in such a situation, I think it is the time of Indian philosophy, Indian classic to emerge. And I can say you with some confidence that today's intellectual has already started working on decolonizing mind or re-theorizing the theory. So that's my humble submission, or it's a kind of summary of Madam's talk. So if I have said something wrong, Madam will correct me. But then right now I will go back to Professor Swarnamay Tripathi and Professor Rajlakshmi Mishra for their comment, or for their any comment or criticism or any observation. So please, Swarnamay Madam.
Good evening, Madam. Good evening, Himanshu Babu. It's really a pleasure. I'm sure your academic journey would have been very, very interesting, because keeping away from all those class theories and feminist theories, you have concentrated on reading the original texts of scriptures and all, and finding out the nectar from that. One thing is coming to my mind. I agree, all of you, what you said is correct, in the sense that for one example is that we all consider that Atal Bihari Vajpayee was more virtuous among the political leaders, having a very ideal living and all. So, like Binobaji, Atal Bihari Vajpayee was also having very popular appeal, and that is how the Bharatiya Janata Party came to power, by putting Atal Bihari Vajpayee's image as the Prime Minister. People were also happy because Vajpayee became the prime minister. And people used to talk about his patriotic jokes. Even today they call when Vajpayee went to Pakistan by bus, and there somebody told that I want to marry you, आप मुझे दहेज में कश्मीर दे दीजिए. Then Vajpayee replied that I am ready to marry you, but आप मुझे दहेज में पाकिस्तान दे सकती है क्या? So people really love the leader. So if people really love the leader, means there is a marriage of virtue and politics, we would say. Uh, mm, Here also in our state, Odisha, people may criticize the chief minister, but people say that the chief minister is not corrupted. किसके लिए वो पैसा लेगा? जैसे हम नो that is how. So what we see that in Indian political system, people appreciate the bachelors because thinking that family may be polluting, maybe provoking them to do corruption and all sorts of things. So, madam, I just want to, you have read so much on virtue and politics, Kant and all these people. How can we keep politics together when you have a very, very unequal class society? That is actually my the understandings that you are having, because I have read Sanskrit a lot when I became diverted from that, but in the beginning I had read this Mudra Rakshas story and all those stories I have read. So what I find is how can we reconcile virtue and politics in an unequal society? In an unequal society, one is starving, the other is like if somebody is seeing the Antilia, the poor man will feel like throwing a bomb at the Antilia. Because until we have not seen the building that is made by the richest person of India. So the poor man who is starving will feel like throwing a bomb at that building. So how will we reconcile virtue and politics in an unequal society? That is actually my query.
So thank you, Sargamai madam. Now I want Rajalakshmi madam, are you there?
Do you want me to respond to this, Himanshu?
Yes, you will come, madam, but let me go back to Rajalakshmi madam. If Rajalakshmi madam, are you there? No, I don't think. Madam, you can answer.
Yeah, thank you so much for making those wonderful comments. You're absolutely right. In India, when they see bachelors and single women, Jayalalitha is an example, right? Here is somebody who was not even married and had no children of her own as per the public image. And it is she who is being called Amma. So I think there is very interesting ways in which people comprehend people without their own families as somehow being beyond corruption. And this goes back to Plato's Republic. If you remember there, when he wanted to abolish families, one of the reasons he wants to do that is because family, he thinks, is the source of nepotism. But we must also balance I think you're correct about it, but at the same time, we also find people like Rajgopalachari who had families and who had healthy love of their own children as well as the larger society. They were also seen as exemplary politicians and exemplary public figures. Now, the other question you're raising about unequal class society, I'm not saying, nor are the people that I'm looking at saying that we must not engage in more equitable distribution of resources. Rajgopalachari, let me take, because his work is fresh in my mind. He's very clear that large economic inequalities will only create resentment. I slightly disagree with you. I think the virtue of the poor people in India is that they are not resentful. They would not want to throw bombs at Antilia. They will only want a little bit to tide over their lives. And this is why we are the extraordinary culture that we are. Of course, they are resentful, but I don't think they will throw a bomb. The people who throw bombs are motivated by other kinds of ideologies. But you are right. I don't think that our attempt to reconcile virtue and politics should dim the fact that there is a lot of work for the state to do with respect to redistribution of resources in an equitable manner. So I'm not suggesting for one moment that those activities and policies should be abandoned. Land sealing or certain other kinds of redistributive work, welfare measures must continue. I'm only saying that our politicians keep on building on resentment. That has to stop. You cannot pit one group against another, one community against another, one class against another. We must deal with those questions, but without necessarily stripping away, I think, the sources of virtue in our citizens and the sources of virtue in our politicians. So I don't think it's one way, one either or. That would be an easy response. And I don't think in politics we ever have any easy resolutions to difficult questions. My point is more limited, Professor Tripathi, that the sources of our virtue must be studied, must be strengthened, even as we try to rectify the enormous caste and class inequalities that still corrupt us as citizens. And I don't see why that work has to be stopped or abandoned. I think there are two questions in the chat boxes, and one is whether a person having an education or an uneducated. I mean, I think my entire talk, Mr. Bera, was about people who are not schooled in theory and who are, in your words, who would be seen as not literate and yet highly cultured and educated people. These were the people who participated in the Bhudan movement. These were the people who are still the agents of the anecdotes that I just shared with you. Another question here is about whether the respect for elder loyalty can become, no, absolutely not. I don't think we should confuse loyalty with becoming a doormat or uncritically accepting what the teachers say. Again, if you go back, as none of you probably do, to the Ur text, which is Bhagavad Gita, and many of the Indian so-called dismissed theological texts, pariprashnena, that is, through respectful inquiry, we must ask. Krishna himself says in the Bhagavad Gita to Arjuna, ask and ask again. When your mind is not clear, you should go to people who are wiser than you, but ask not to test their knowledge, but in order to know genuinely more about a doubt that you have. So pariprashnena, that is questioning and counter questioning, you must try to know. Loyalty need not mean accepting everything uncritically. But I was talking less about loyalty to teachers and more about respect for teachers. One must reconcile respect with questioning, and the two can go together. I think there's another question here, which is politics a virtue? I don't understand this question. My whole talk was about how even when you're pursuing success in politics, it need not always be anchored in opportunism. And I think this is a lesson that we can draw if we read Kautilya seriously. When you say politics itself is a virtue, I don't know what you mean. Pursuit of ruthless power after power is not seen as a virtue. We've already talked about Machiavelli. Let me see the whole thing. But if we see Gandhi, how could we understand these two phenomena? Well, usually people go to Gandhi, and that's why today I decided to go to people other than Gandhi to look at how the two phenomena, ethics and politics, need not be mutually divorced from one another. Even in Machiavelli, I have a slightly different reading. The conventional reading is that he was against all kinds of ethics. But if you read the discourses on Livy, which is the larger book that he wrote for republics, you'll find that even he is not completely separating ethics and politics. And by the way, even in Machiavelli, the separation between ethics and politics is a very limited point he's making for ambitious rulers. He's not suggesting this for ordinary people. All right. So I think some of the questions I've addressed.
So thank you. Thank you, madam. Thank you, madam. I mean, Professor Rajalakshmi Mishra has again rejoined with us. So Rajalakshmi, madam, if you want to say something, you can say. Professor Rajalakshmi Mishra.
Yes. Hello, madam.
You can.
Really, yes,
madam, you can.
Am I
want
audible?
to see your face.
Oh, okay. Hello, madam. Good evening. It was indeed a very good lecture and very based on original works. And indeed, I was very happy to that you have gone through so many original works of Indian mythology as well as the writings. One thing that just bothers me is that very soon we are going to have our municipal elections as well as local elections. And we find that the contestants of the major political parties, especially the ruling party, is distributing money among the voters of the slum areas. Now, in a society where we have poverty, where we have inequality, the politicians are not becoming virtuous because they are trying to bribe the voters. At the same time, voters also are not thinking that, I mean, they are of the thought that whoever is giving us money, we are going to vote him. So that is the problem. So could you just tell us how can, in such a society, how can there be a, I mean, virtuous society? Politics and virtue can be interrelated. As Plato said that there should be the philosopher kings, should be rulers. Aristotle said that the virtue, in a society, people will have virtuous life and they should be happy. If the rulers are virtuous, then the people will have a good life and a happy life. So just in the Indian context, it is really, I mean, thought-provoking. Just I want your ideas.
Yeah, I think these are very hard realities of our world. I'm told that in Tamil Nadu, they put, they said you cannot distribute money. So in the rice, they hide the rupee notes and it comes hidden. I think over the years, so initially I was very apprehensive and I'm still not sure that this is a very good practice. But I think there are ways of making sense of this practice. And I want to share another anecdote with you, which will tell you that people exercise agency even in the midst of this kind of corruption. We think that they are being bought and sold, but I think the popular intelligence is something that we underestimate. And this has been my concern, that as scholars, we are often distanced from the popular agency and its extraordinary kind of prudence. So here is my anecdote, which again I share and I put it in that book that Himanshu mentioned. I had a domestic help. I have a lot of conversations, it appears, with these people. And once I asked Sharda, how did she vote? And she said, I voted for the hand because we work with our hands. And I voted for the lotus because the lotus is sacred. This was extraordinary, I thought. So what happens when the minute they go to vote, all kinds of things are at play in their minds. The symbols move them, the images move them, something they've heard moves them. So the contingent act, the act of voting is actually such a contingent act. And we tend to understand it in causal terms. We think that they have been bought and sold. I doubt it. I think within the constraints, they exercise some amount of agency, and our voting studies are not doing justice to all this because we ignore all this. Having said that, I think you're right. This is a very troubling phenomenon. And this is why I'm not of the opinion that all our politicians are virtuous. We all know that they are complete opportunists, many of them, and they are seeking the path of success at any cost. But we as citizens, I think, have to hold on to the possibility. We shouldn't become skeptical. If we become skeptical, then everything becomes just expediency, right? So as scholars, I'm thinking, how do we restore confidence that these two things can be reconciled, that there are examples of people who have done it and done it successfully? If we don't keep these memories alive, I think we'll just become skeptical and become victims of this expedient politics. That is why I do the work that I do. Of course, it has a very limited value, it has a very limited impact. But I never underestimate the impact of moving the hearts of the young souls and minds which are in our charge. These stories today, they may disagree with you, but when they get older, they'll say, aha, I remember that story, I remember that talk, and this is why I want to be virtuous today. So I think what we are doing, of course, there are a lot of politicians of this expedient, opportunistic variety who are trying to bribe, who are trying to undermine the electoral democracy. But I don't think they are going to have the last word. That's my hope. So,
Yes,
and
right.
there was another take on this the other day by my postmodern colleague, and who said, why are you so self-righteous about these 500 rupees and 1000 rupees that they are distributing? Don't you see that this is one way of redistributing and being generous? I thought, okay, that's a thought. But when it becomes systemically corrupt, then we worry about this phenomenon. And I think you're rightly worried about it. So, yes, we continue to worry about it and we must try to change it. But at the same time, the silver lining underlying this, I think, is people are not so naive to be fully bought and bribed like this. They exercise their agency even in this corrupt system. And I think that gives me hope.
Thank you, madam. Thank you. Your lecture was indeed very, very nice. Thank you very much. We are looking forward to listen to your lecture again.
So thank you, Rajlakshmi madam, and thank you, Vasanthi madam. I mean, the problem of today's lecture, I mean, the problem is the social inequality, right? So how one will follow the path of spiritualism in a society that is based on inequalities of different forms. While delivering a talk for Gangadhar Mehri University on cultural nationalism, I found interesting thing given by Aurobindo and Vivekananda. For Vivekananda, he was saying that spiritualism cannot enter to an empty stomach. So to him, spiritual knowledge must accompany with secular thought and secular work. And both were trying to give the concept of nationalism for India. I mean cultural nationalism. In their concept of cultural nationalism, even Aurobindo, he has also said that the nationalism does not discount inequality, but it has the capacity to dissolve the difference among differences arising out of them. So inequality will be there. I mean, an equal society is not possible. But out of that inequality, what negativities that comes out of that inequality, that can be handled through spiritualism, that can be handled through different virtue, right? I think we need to understand the significance of spiritualism in the context of a unequal society in that perspective, that inequality will continue, right? You see different governments, right? They are talking about rights, liberty, and equality, a just society, but till now we are not arrived at. And why the society is just like that what it was before, or the condition has been very worst also, right? So the simple point is that it is through this spiritualism one can get the happiness, one can be the source of happiness, and one can be the source of happiness for others also. So that is the importance of spiritualism. The more you enter into all these classes, then you can find all these things. Just go through Gita, actually you can find how Lord Krishna has rationalized all the human problems, and what is the significance of giving then, or what is the significance of duty then. Right, I think the time has come that we need to rethink our political theory, and the process has been started. And since this is the 8th or 9th talk, and the last previous 7 or 8 speaker, they have also hinted to that direction, that time has come to decolonize our mind, time has come to learn from our own classic, and time has come to protect ourselves from our intimate enemy. So we have to know who is our intimate enemy. So madam, if I'm saying something or anything wrong, you can correct me, madam. And after that, I will ask Sanjay to give a vote of thanks. Please, madam, you can correct me if I have said anything wrong.
No, Dr. Himanshu, it's been a long evening. I think thank you very much for having me, and hope to see you all in person at some point. That would be nice. I always enjoy visiting that part of India. I'm a big fan of Rath Yatra. So thank you, and let's move to closing this.
So Sanjay, now I request you to, Sanjay is working with me for his MPhil degree, and he is working on populism or populist politics. So I request Sanjay to give a vote of thanks.
Thank you, sir.
There's one
good evening
at the very end. Should you entertain him, Mr. Vishwanath Sahu?
Yes.
Hello. Good
Yes.
evening, ma'am.
Yes, Vishwanath, you can continue. You can
namaste.
speak to our speaker.
Ma'am, namaste. Ma'am, I have a question that if you see a secular country like India, where different religions have different virtue like Hindu and Muslim, how we can practice a virtue politics in India to maintain the secular decorum in India, and to avoid the conspiracy like CA, where Hindu Muslims become very serious conflict among the people.
For deliberate purposes, I did not evoke any religious sources. If you noticed, I was talking about epics and plays from the Indian context. I think if you read Abul Fazl on Akbar, you will find that similar virtues of generosity and mutual aid are celebrated there. If you look at Khanun-e-Humayuni by Kwandamir on Humayun, you will find the parallels to the virtues that I have just presented. So I don't think being of a different religion means therefore that there can be no practice of virtues. I only talked about political virtues. I was not talking about theological virtues. I was not talking about piety or faith. These are theological virtues. Okay? I was talking specifically about political virtues that are practiced in the secular world as you talk about it. Hence, being of any religion need not deter people from following these virtues. In fact, this is another problem. We are so obsessed with two debates: secularism, communalism axis, and the nationalism axis. And this is blinding us to many other important activities that are part of building citizenships in a democratic polity. Okay? If you want to know more, your teacher already has a book of mine. I would suggest that you read from there. But like I told you, neither being a Christian, nor being of the Aboriginal faith, nor being of Islamic faith needs to deter you from the three virtues that I've picked up here as politically relevant virtues, which are principled, flexibility, and loyalty. I talk about this as practical wisdom in my work, and mutual aid, generosity, and friendship, which I haven't talked about in this talk, but which is at the very center of this new book of mine. And I'm telling you the sources. Go back and read your Abul Fazl and the kind of prototype of Akbar that he's building there. Look at Kanun-e Humayuni by Khwanda Mir, and you will see, or the notion of akhlaq among the Islamic scholars, which is all about virtue.
So thank you, madam. Now please, Sanjay, you can provide the vote of thanks.
Thank you, sir. Good evening to all, honorable dignitaries, distinguished speaker, Professor Vasanthi Srinivasan, madam, convener of this webinar, Dr. Himanshu Sekhar Mishra, respected Professor Gitanjali Das, ma'am, Professor Rajalakshmi Mishra, and Professor Swarnamay Tripathi, madam. It's my privilege to have been asked to propose a vote of thanks to this webinar. I'm Sanjay Meher. On behalf of all the participants, feels immense pleasure to propose a vote of thanks. And first of all, I would like to give my hearty thanks to our speaker, Professor Vasanthi Srinivasan, madam, for presenting and for making an excellent present and making this webinar a grateful one. It was really indeed a thought-provoking session. Madam defined virtue and politics from various sources like Machiavelli's Prince, Panchatantra ki kahani, Chanakya's Mudra Rakshasa, and she has given many examples like Krishna's Arjuna, Lord Rama, and Binaba Bhave's Bhudan, and thought of Sri Rajgopalchari. The point which I liked most is virtue is not peripheral to politics. It is core to politics. And she pointed out loyalty, generosity, ethical tolerance are most sources of virtue. Actually, it was indeed a great talk, madam, based on original text. Then I would like to say thank you to convener of this webinar, Dr. Himanshu Sekhar Mishra, for organizing such a brilliant webinar. We, the students of Sambalpur University, feels grateful, and we are lucky to get a chance to connect with the academia of this academia world, and we are grateful to you, sir, for learning from resource person from other universities. Then I would like to say thank you to Professor Gitanjali Das ma'am, Rajalakshmi ma'am, and Swarnamay Tripathi for attending this webinar. And last but not the least, I would like to express my vote of thanks to all the participants who have lived with us and attended this webinar with great enthusiasm. In the end, thank you all for being with us today. Have a wonderful day. Thank you, ma'am.
So thank you, Sanjay, and I am also thankful to my teacher, Vasanthi madam. I mean, earlier some unfortunate things happened, but somehow I brought her to my platform, and we learned many things. We know some of the things, but the things is that we need to practice it. So those who don't know, they must know. Those who know, they try to practice, so that one can change the society, one can change the politics. But remember, suffering is the must. Through suffering, one can achieve it. Right? So thank you, madam. Thank you very much. Namaste. So I'm stopping the recording.
Sure. Thank you so much, Dr. Himanshu.